Thank you very much indeed, Eddie, for that very kind introduction. And can I begin off by thanking Colin Campbell for having organised this conference and indeed for setting up the Peak Oil Association. How I came across Colin in the beginning was I was speaking on a platform in Chicago in 2003 with a bloke called Matt Simmons. And Matt Simmons was talking about peak oil. He was talking about the wrong price signals having been given throughout the 90s. And he wrote a book called Twilight in the Desert, which somebody else referred to this morning, which is an excellent read, at least the first 2 chapters and the last one. And I rang him up early in 2004 and I said, I'm running a small little policy conference here in Dublin, and would you be able to come to it? And he said, what date is that? And I said, such a date in April. Oh, he said, sorry, I'm in San Diego. But why are you asking me? Why didn't you ask the real man? And I said, who's that? Well, he's a bloke called Colin Campbell. And I said, where does he live? He lives in Ballydehob. And I said, what? What? So anyway, Colin wasn't in the book, but 2 weeks later we did find him. And he came and he spoke. But since then he's gone from strength to strength. And let me compliment you, Colin, on this tremendous conference here. It's at the polar opposite to one I spoke at last week in Salzburg. I was speaking in English, everybody else was German, and a joke went down like a lead balloon. Anyway, to begin the serious business of communicating here with you today, I accept as a given that oil has or is about to reach its peak. Except as another given that human-induced global warming is a fact. It's a fact that is killing the planet. It's going to reduce the number of species and the biodiversity on the planet by 1 million by the middle of this century. We're actually at 480 parts per million now if you include in greenhouse gas equivalents, which includes methane and CO2. And our species was conceived and born and evolved at 280 parts per million. And it was that thought that led me to set up Future Wind Partnership in 1997. I really did believe that there was a business opportunity here to do the right thing, and so we set up Future Wind Partnership then. When you accept peak oil, you begin to ask yourself, well, what's going to happen next? Who's going to get that oil and where is it going to go to? And just a few words about China before I start talking about delivering the sustainable solution for Ireland. But China last year built 103,000 megawatts of electricity producing plant. That is, they built an electricity system the size of Ireland every 3 weeks. And that's not being fuelled with wind or any other renewable, that's being fuelled mainly with coal. Mr. Hu Jintao, the Premier, 2 weeks ago was down at an energy conference in Australia where he was buying Australian liquefied natural gas. He recently, or the Chinese government, bought all the oil and gas reserves of Kazakhstan 2 years ago. 5 weeks ago they bought all the gas reserves of Turkmenistan. Mr. Chavez of Venezuela has been out there and saying for a seat on the Security Council you can have all Venezuelan oil as well. They've bought, I believe, 30% of the Great Stockman field. They're already running in a gas pipeline from Sakhalin 1 from ExxonMobil. They own 60% of the Sudan's oil and natural gas, and they have their army stationed there. They've spent 2.5 billion recently offshore in Nigeria. Now, I say all these things not in any sense of condemnation of China. I have absolute regard for those people. The Great Wall, 6,500 kilometres of it, is still standing. There are 7 civil engineers in the Politburo. And China will have a standard of living equal to the West within the next 30 years. And it will build that on what oil and gas is left, because that's what we showed them to do, and that's what they're doing. There's one purchaser in China, and that's the government. There's one purchaser in India, and that's the India Oil and Gas Company. And when it comes to competing with them, even Europe pales by insignificance. I mean, there are twice as many people in China as the United States and Europe put together and multiplied by 2. And at this stage of their growth, they're increasing their energy consumption by 20% per annum. So we're looking at a crisis of unprecedented proportions for this country. We're small, we're peripheral. We know we're leprechauns and that we're great and we'll make out in the end, but the fact is we're at the end of every pipeline. We have no big company that can say, I'm capable of writing a big check for you over the next 40 years, like in fact the Chinese or the Indian governments are able to do, or indeed the Americans. And just at a time when we needed Europe to be a singular force, to organise fuel for us around the world, we find that there's no energy treaty in Europe. And this is to be lamented at this particular point in time. So this conference has been really good. You love a conference where there's some confrontation and some buzz. And I want to give just a little bit of advice to Professor Walton. When you're justifying nuclear, please don't do it at the expense of wind. Because if you do it wrong, well then we'll think that nuclear is wrong. Like for instance, you did say that wind was an intermittent source. Well, wind is only an intermittent source when it's looked at locally. So here in Cork it's intermittent, or in Dublin, or anywhere else. But if you join them all up together, the wind is always blowing somewhere, and so you deliver a firm source of power, every bit as firm as the nuclear reactor. Except in 75 years' time we won't have 4,000 tons of plutonium, radioactive cesium, and strontium-90. And also when you say that we have a capacity factor, and when you say that we have a capacity factor in Ireland of 25%, again, the fact isn't right. Airtricity has about 11 wind farms in Ireland, and our capacity factor is 35, just a little bit bigger than 35%. So, the key fundamentals remain. We're going to talk about Ireland now and how to deliver a sustainable Ireland. And the key fundamentals are the same. And I'm going to introduce a new key fundamental here, which I hope will be something that you haven't heard of before. I wasn't, unfortunately, able to be at the conference yesterday. But that's about competitive advantage for Ireland using our natural resource. So, let's move on. So here's what the government has set as a target, and it's a great pleasure to have Eamon Ryan among us today. We're currently making about just over 70 million tonnes of CO2. And business as usual, that's BAU. Business as usual will deliver by 2020 almost 80 million tonnes a year. If we were to do Kyoto, we'd take it down to over 60. If we did put in 33% renewable energy, we'd take it down to still above the 1990 levels. But the government has set a target for us of a reduction of 3% a year in our carbon emissions by 2020. And that takes us to the yellow vertical line on the right-hand side. So I have said to Eamon, and I've said to our Taoiseach, this is probably the equivalent of America saying it was going to get to the moon by 1970. They gave themselves 10 years. I believe we can do it, and I love a firm target, but it's not going to be easy. Even Britain, who's tried to deal with global warming since Tony Blair was in power, actually has increased its carbon output by 7% since 1997. I hope that fact is right. I see Michael Meacher here, and I'm sure he'll put me right if it's not. Just to go on to the next slide then, have a look. We have some very ambitious targets, but not some very clear pathways of how to get there. We see that energy efficiency is supposed to yield 6.7 million tonnes a year. I believe that's quite doable, but we need a thoroughgoing programme from the government, the likes of which Germany and Britain have been doing for 10 years, and we have no experience out here, but it's doable. There's the National Climate Change Strategy, and like you, I have no idea what that's about. And carbon sinks, I think we're cutting away our carbon sinks. I used to be in charge of that process in the bogs, and now, thankfully, I'm not a sinner any longer. And so now we have a really big problem, and if we do 33% energy, we'll actually remove 5.2 million tonnes of carbon. But even if all those things are done, there's still a gap. To get to the government target of a 3% reduction by 2020, there's a gap left of 5.7 million tonnes of CO2. And actually that equates, to 4,000 megawatts of offshore wind, and we're going to talk a lot more about that during this presentation. So, and by the way, we're assuming in the 33% reduction, or the 33% of electricity from renewables, we're assuming that there's 6,000 megawatts of onshore wind energy installed in the country. And to do that, there's significant challenges. The current position, we'll have about 3,100 megawatts built by 2012. Now that's a lot of megawatts. In fact, that's the megawattage that Denmark, the modern-day inventor of wind energy, that's what they have on their system. And we have plans to go to twice that. And it's really impossible to go beyond that 3,100 without serious upgrades to the grid and without a sea change in our attitude towards planning here in Ireland. As you know, well, some of you know that we do a lot of business in Texas. And one of the great things that Texas has done recently is they declared about 7 competitive renewable energy zones. So they've asked the private sector to spell out for them how they could create zones where wind energy was very abundantly available, and how this could get taken into the big centres of population at Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, etc. So we are suggesting to the government that they do something similar here in Ireland, set up 4 competitive renewable energy zones within the country. And now that's within the island as a whole, because, as you know, shortly we're going to an all-island energy market. One in West Northern Ireland, one in Donegal, one in Mayo approximately, and one in the southwest approximately. So we believe that if that is done, we can get to 6,100 megawatts by 2020. But here's an example of Mayo for you. See all that kind of pink cerise colour there? I'm not so sure what it is. But that's where you can't build in Mayo. That's what the planners in Mayo say you can't do. Now, I lived in Mayo for 2 years, Grand County, but not all beautiful. And, not all, that should not be like that. There's cracking winds up there. There's enough wind there to build 2,000 megawatts if you wanted to. But that's what the Mayo planners say you can't do. And here's another picture. That's where all the people are. Now, you can't be putting huge quantities of wind turbines where all the people are. And so there has to be a change, and it has to be led by the government, and wind energy has to become a national priority if we're going to deliver on lots of wind energy from counties like this. And we need to upgrade the grid. Now, I have to say, I'm not here complaining. Actually, I think what the government has done is great. I think Eamon Ryan's impact as a minister is already seriously significant. I think and one of the most significant things is, of course, that our Prime Minister, the Taoiseach, has embraced this green agenda now. So we're making suggestions here. We're not criticising in any way, but the grids are going to be upgraded. And another very interesting change that's come about, and everybody will know that I will tell it like I see it, and that we had to abandon building wind in Ireland over the past 5 years because there was a moratorium put on us and we weren't welcome. But right now we see AirGrid, the same people who said there should be a moratorium, suggesting these upgrades to the grid. So we're very grateful for that, and we think that they're really working with the government to try and deliver these 6,000 megawatts on land. So this is a good news story. But as we say, it only goes so far, and there are significant challenges. The green line there is a 275,000 volt line in Northern Ireland, and then there's various red connectors and blue. I mean, that's all technical stuff, but that all has to be built. And it's very hard to get planning permission for overhead lines in Ireland. It's very hard to get planning permission for overhead lines in Germany, Scotland, Russia, Canada, the United States, anywhere in the world. And if we want to get them, you have to allow a lead time of 10 years. So we have to start now. If Ireland wants to actually deliver that 1/3 of its electricity from renewables, we have to start now. It's no good starting in 5 years' time. So we have a challenge there, and we need coordinated national planning. I mean, this slide just says what we've really been saying up to now, that we really have to get together industry, the government, semi-state sectors, and indeed any of the think tanks that are around. which have been singularly bereft in ideas about how we do sustainability in Ireland up to now. But again, we're looking forward to a complete revolution in government thinking here. We have often talked, and I'm sure members of this audience have heard me suggest before, that we should be building big grids out in the sea. We should be building the offshore supergrid in Europe. Last November the 1st, we met with Tony Blair and we explained the concept to him, and we asked him to bring it up with Mrs. Merkel, and later on in the House of Parliament he said he had met with Mrs. Merkel on the subject. 2 weeks ago I met with the Taoiseach on the subject. I got a very positive response, and I met with Gerhard Schroeder last week. This is not a name-dropping exercise. How can somebody who runs a small business like me get to see prime ministers of countries? And the reason we can do it is because we've got the answer. Because we're actually saying, we're not throwing our hands in there and saying, well, if China doesn't do it, we're not going to do it. Here is the answer. There's enough wind out there to power the whole of Ireland, to power the whole of Britain, to power the whole of Europe. And the only thing that constrains us is the grids and the extent of the grids that we have. So we've had a look at where the 4,000 megawatts would go offshore in Ireland, we at Airtricity, that is, and we've come up with a map like this. Ireland has an unusual eastern border with the sea there, in that there's a lot of shallow sandbanks. You'll all know about the Kish Bank and the Codling Bank and the Arklow Banks, where we built the first wind farm in Ireland, all the way down to Wexford and even around the coast a little bit. So there's lots of room out there, and the wind speeds that you get are in the order of 9.5 metres a second, which gives you a capacity factor of about 40 to 42%. So there's huge, cracking, big capacity factors to be had there in perpetuity for Ireland. So we're suggesting that what we should do is, because wind is a variable source of power, it's a very forecastable source of power, but it's very variable. So if we're going to bet on the future of wind energy, not alone, we don't actually mind what other sources, renewable sources, are put into the equation, just so long as they're renewable. We should be linked up with the continent, and we should be linked up with the North Sea, so that we're collecting the wind over a gigantic area and we're delivering firm power day and night. And as part of this solution, I would see us dealing with the transport issue here in Ireland. Because if we had electric cars, and we just bought a Toyota Prius in our house a couple of weeks ago, you can store the electricity when it's being generated by the wind at night, because the wind also blows at night. You store it in the batteries, and if you had some smart batteries, which I've come across in Maryland in the United States, they can actually feed back to the grid in the event of some failure of some big power stations. So here's the solution that will be, if taken forward and if built in with demonstration projects, that can deliver on a huge part of Europe's electricity needs for the future and deliver it sustainably. So interconnection with Europe is what we should do in terms of security of energy supply. We were very delighted, by the way, to see Britain support Germany in its desire to have 20% of its power, of all its energy coming from renewables by 2020. This is a very big target. It actually means that 33% of all electricity in Europe will be made from renewables by 2020. We've seen, by the way, in the United States as well, President Bush saying that we should be making 20% of the United States electricity from renewables, and do it soon. He's a big supporter of wind. This is a depiction of the supergrid. We're on our second reprint of this, and I anticipate, when the Taoiseach asked me, how long would it take to deliver on this? Well, when you work out the environmental plans that you have to do, allocate the areas, make sure that it's not all falling into one company's hands, all that good regulation stuff, it'll probably take us 7 years before we could start on this. But that's providing that we start now. So we've already said that the supergrid is an undersea set of cables. This is not a pipe dream. This isn't a vision of somebody who's, let out for the day and gets his monthly injection. We've actually been talking to ABB, and ABB are the ones who proposed the kind of technology that we'd use to move power around the place. That would be the HVDC light technology. So it's an Airtricity ABB conception, this, and they've been very supportive of the whole idea. And as I said, we deliver firm energy. It's going to be expensive to build it in the beginning, but then you're tapped into a free source of fuel. So I think I've basically covered all those points, but I'm going to try and, well, let me say just what's needed here first in Ireland. Britain has a very strong support mechanism for offshore wind. Germany has a very strong support mechanism, and it's making it even stronger. The Dutch have a strong support mechanism. The French, the Spaniards. We're missing one in Ireland. We haven't got one at all. But we're not in any way trying to pressurise the Minister on this issue, because he's already said that he knows that if we're trading internationally, well, our support scheme has to be broadly in line. But that's an important point. It'll never start, because the price of wind turbines have gone up 50% over the last 3 years, because world demand is outstripping supply at an enormous rate. Just for instance, we've got 10 wind speed measuring masts up in Inner Mongolia. And if we thought the winds in Texas and the west coast of Ireland were good, well, I'm happy to report to this audience that they're just equally as good in Inner Mongolia. So we have an eye on China, just like Skibbereen Eagle. Anyway, we need a good support mechanism. Now, the market price for wind in Ireland is actually 6.5 cents a kilowatt hour. And what's wind worth on the system? You've all heard it. Wind is too expensive. And that's why we didn't do any for the last 14 years. I won't actually name the names, but if pressed, I might later on. So we say the value of wind on the Irish system is actually 14 cents a kilowatt hour. And let me take you through how that is. When the wind blew last November, we noticed that the price of electricity on the Irish market fell. But that wasn't just noticed in Ireland. It was noticed in Germany when 20,000 megawatts of wind were blowing throughout the month of November and throughout the month of December. And the price was zero in Germany for electricity for a large part of that time due to wind energy. That's the effect that wind has. So instead of saying wind is expensive, we should be saying to ourselves, how can we get our hands on this stuff quickly enough so we can reduce the price of electricity and so we can attract foreign industry here, so we can compete with China, so we can compete with India, so we don't have to be relying on what was once cheap labour but is now just as expensive as Germany and Denmark. That's the challenge here, because when the wind blows, you turn off your most expensive generator. And I asked some very bright young people in Airtricity, I said, what was that worth last winter? And they said, that was worth 8.5 cents to the ESB. So they made a big windfall gain whenever the wind blew last year. And we're only at 10%. We're going to be at 20% sometime this spring. So we're going to see falling prices. Another thing about this, of course, the price of fossil fuels goes down when the wind blows. Like 20,000 megawatts in Germany is something that's like 3 times the size of the Irish electricity system, delivering effectively free power at the margin. So the demand for fossil fuels goes down, and so the price goes down. And when that lasts long enough, it's not just the spot price that goes down, but perceptions of the future indicate that the price will be going down. So we figured this is worth 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So, in other words, the price effect. And this study was done. What have I left, Eddie? How much time have I left? I'm not fine. All right. I just saw a yellow light here. I was wondering when the red one was going to come. Anyway, so the spot price for fossils goes down when the wind blows, and that's up to 12 cents a kilowatt hour saved already. Now, risk. We all know that as the peak of oil approaches, and certainly past it, the trend is not just like that. The trend is going to be violent swings like that, which are very corrosive for business. And the country that can actually deal with that risk is the country that's going to win. And we had a study done in Scotland by the late, my friend Shimon Auerbach, who was killed in a plane crash this year, but he applied the Markovich theory of risk management to putting wind on the Scottish system. And he figured out that if they went from 20% wind in Scotland to 30%, they would reduce the price by a further 6%, just because they reduced the risk. Now, the equations of this are are challenging for a businessman like me to try and start describing, but I did understand them. And Markovich has already proved that this is the way it goes when you invest in stocks and shares. And what Shimon did was just apply this to wind energy and found you actually reduced the price by another 0.5%. And then, of course, the final bit of the equation is that when you make electricity with wind energy, you don't pay any carbon fines. And at the price of carbon of 1850 euros per tonne, that turns out to be about 1.1 cents. So our total saving from each unit of wind on the system is 14.1 cents. Bet you never had anybody tell you that before. And I've said this to TXU. The way I found out about this, by the way, was we've a long-term contract with TXU, and they said to us, "Who's going to maintain that plant after 5 years when Siemens goes away and you have to take over the maintenance?" And we said, "We're going to maintain it. We're terrific at that." They said, "We don't believe you. We need you to put up a bond." And our net present value for the total wind plant in year one was 41 million. They said you're going to have to put up a bond of 83 million. Now that means that they put a value. We were putting one value on the wind, and they were putting a value 3 times that. So it was worth 10 cents to them. So somewhere in that window there, between 10 cents and 14 cents, is what wind is really worth on the system. And when talking to the E.ON people last week, the biggest German utility and one of the biggest in the world, they published 3 papers on how wind collapsed the price on the German system last year. Not very good for wind producers like me who are trying to make a profit out of selling the stuff, but if you're a consumer or if you're a national planner, has there ever been a more wondrous story? Anyway, so we want to finish up with just on a few points, and the main message I want to leave you with: the future is there for us. We don't have to rely on our purchasing managers who have to try and somehow compete with China. All we've got to do is be inventive about reaching out into the resources that are there, freely available to us, that will produce a free source of power in perpetuity into the seas around Europe. We have to do this in cooperation, and I like people to have a concept, and just one concept. Wind is not a national resource. Wind is a continental resource, which if we all join together with this, all the countries, Germany, Denmark, who've both stopped building on land because there's no more room left there, and now they're reaching out into the sea, Britain, France, Italy, and all the other countries with the grids, and we build these grids, then we've created for ourselves not only a sustainable future, but a future in which our industry actually outcompetes the rest of the world, because at the margin, and after we've paid off the debt, you're into free fuel, and you've dramatically changed the whole scene, the whole climatic scene, the whole oil scene, the whole energy demand scene in Europe. And Europe leads the world. 200,000 people are employed in Germany now making wind turbines. When I was talking to Schroeder last week, I said, if we do the supergrid, you will see 3 million people employed across Europe. So, I'm going to finish at that, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks very much for your attention.